Sign it, or I will make sure you walk away with nothing." My brother hissed as he shoved the $6 million settlement papers across the kitchen table, so violently that the coffee exploded over my lap and burned through my jeans. I did not even have time to flinch before he leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour and full of the same contempt I had swallowed since childhood. "You are not going to win, Jade. I will take everything. Every last cent." His voice was low enough that only I could hear it, but sharp enough to carve straight through my chest. The kitchen in my mother's Meridian house smelled like burnt toast and cheap peppermint creamer, and the old heater coughed somewhere in the hallway, but all I could hear was the ringing in my ears. My mother, Elaine, stood at the counter pretending to rinse a mug while her shoulders trembled with the kind of silence that hurts more than yelling. Luke did not stop. He never does. "You never belonged to this family anyway. You ran off to play with your little computers. You were never here for Dad. You do not get to swoop in now and take half of what he built." My fingers tightened around the edge of the table, but I forced my face to stay calm. Inside, everything shook. He tapped the signature line with one impatient finger. "Sign it. If you contest this, I will drag you through court until you are broke. I know people. I know how to make things ugly, and I will." The humiliation hit harder than the threat. It was not just the money. It was the familiarity of his cruelty, the way he said broke, like it was a curse I deserved. My mother finally turned around, clutching her mug like it might shield her. "Sweetie, your brother has been the one here for years. You moved away, remember? It is only fair he gets more. Do not make this difficult." Her voice was trembling, but not with fear of him. With fear of conflict, with fear of disappointing her favorite child. Something inside me cracked, but not in the way it used to. I was done being the quiet one. I looked at the papers again, and something cold and steady settled in my chest. They did not know that I earned more than $300,000 a year in Seattle. They did not know that I was the lead risk and compliance strategist for one of the fastest growing fintech companies in the Pacific Northwest. They did not know that I owned equity worth millions or that investors had started using my name in boardroom conversations. They never asked. They never cared. To them, I was still the girl who left home and therefore forfeited any claim to belonging. I stood slowly, the coffee dripping down my knees. "I am not signing anything." Luke laughed a short, spiteful sound. "You think you have choices. You think you have power. You are alone, Jade. No husband, no kids, no one to back you up. You cannot beat me in court. You do not have the stamina." He leaned back, smirking like he already won. And if Dad were here, he would say the same. That was the sentence that finally made my vision blur. Dad would never have said that. He was the only one who saw me. The only one who trusted me with his passwords and his accounts and his worries about the business. He once whispered to me in the hospital just before the chemo fog swallowed him, "Do not let them erase you. They will try." My throat tightened, but I kept my posture straight. Then his words came back like a hand on my spine, pushing me forward. I walked out of the kitchen. My mother called after me. "Jade, wait, please, your brother is just stressed." Luke shouted, "You walk away from this and you will regret it." I did not look back. That night, in a cheap roadside motel outside Boise, I sat on the corner of the bed, still wearing the coffee-soaked jeans, staring at my laptop screen. Snow piled against the window, and my breath fogged the glass every time I exhaled. I opened my email. There it was. A message from Daniel Reyes, forensic specialist investor consultant, and one of the sharpest minds in financial ethics I had ever met. Subject line, Aspen. New Year invitation still open. His previous message had included a simple note. If you ever need a reset, come. Good people, good strategy, good mountains. My fingers hovered over the keys. For years I had stayed quiet, absorbing the insults, pretending the distance did not hurt, pretending the money did not matter. But tonight something shifted. I typed slowly, almost ceremonially. Daniel, is that invitation still open? I think I finally have a reason to stop being quiet. As soon as I hit send, my hands stopped shaking. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the beginning of something that tasted almost like power. If your own sibling threatened to take everything you had worked for, would you sign, or would you start planning your comeback? Tell me in the comments while we move on. I grew up in Meridian, where the roads were quiet and the winters felt heavier than they should, and where every expectation about who you were supposed to become was decided long before you learned how to decide anything for yourself. And in our house on Sand Creek Court, everyone seemed to know that Luke was the heir by birthright, while I was simply the daughter who read too much and asked too many questions and never seemed to fit into the neat picture my mother tried to paint of a simple Idaho family with simple Idaho values. And even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear neighbors calling him our little man, the future owner of Porter Heat and Air, while no one ever asked what I wanted or what I cared about, because it was obvious to them that girls who preferred books and numbers and computers were nothing more than hobbies waiting to be abandoned once real life came along. My father Thomas built that HVAC company with his bare hands and long nights and stubborn pride. And by the time Luke and I reached high school, he had grown the business into something worth more than $2 million with equipment yards, land around Boise, a retirement account, and a home full of tools and paperwork that smelled like Freon and dust, and a lifetime of sacrifice. And it was understood by everyone except me that the company would someday belong to Luke because he was the son, and the town already saw him as the second generation, even though he barely knew how to fix a thermostat without calling Dad for help. When I was 16, I won a small regional coding competition. Nothing extravagant. But to me, it felt like the first time I could breathe, like someone had lit a match inside my brain, and suddenly the world made sense. And I remember running into the kitchen clutching the certificate while Dad grinned and clapped me on the back. But Luke only laughed and said, "What are you going to do?" Fix boilers with Python, and my mother chimed in with one of her gentle cuts that always looked like affection to outsiders, but felt like a pin pushed under the skin when she said, "Just do not forget real life. Jade screens will not hug you when you are old." And the whole room laughed, except Dad, who looked at me in a way that told me he had wanted to say something but didn't know how. I learned early that disappointment does not always come sharply. Sometimes it arrives in small, familiar ways, a look, a sigh, a quiet comparison that makes you shrink without realizing it. And by the time I graduated high school, I knew Meridian saw me as the odd one, the intense girl, the overthinker, the one who needed to grow up and stop chasing city nonsense and come home to where real people lived. But I left anyway. I left because somewhere deep down, I knew I would drown if I stayed. And at 25, I became one of the earliest employees at a small Seattle fintech startup called LumaPay, a tiny team working out of a rented office that smelled like burnt coffee and ambition. And no one could have predicted that within a few years, our software would make national news, or that venture capital firms would fight for a seat at our table, or that I would be granted 2.5% equity at a valuation that climbed past $300 million by the time I turned 32. I tried telling my family once, tried explaining that our platform was becoming one of the most trusted fraud tracing systems in the region, tried describing how regulators and banks had started calling us for guidance. But all my mother asked was, "When are you coming back to do something real?" And Luke smirked and said, "Seattle will get tired of you. Eventually, just come home and help with the business like a normal person." And I sat there with a plate of roast beef in front of me, wondering how many years would pass before I finally stopped hoping they might someday care about the world I had built. Dad was the only one who tried. He did not always understand my work, but he bragged in his shop to customers, telling them, "My girl builds systems that catch bad guys with money," even though he never phrased it right. And customers barely believed him because no one in Meridian could imagine that the girl who used to sit alone at lunch reading coding magazines was now advising companies bigger than their entire town. And yet Dad believed it. And in his quiet, clumsy way, he was proud. I sent money home regularly, $1,000, sometimes $1,500 a month, because Dad never asked. But I knew the medical bills and the business repairs and the winter heating costs piled up. And when I sent the transfers, Luke always found a way to belittle it, calling it a tip from the Queen of Seattle and claiming Dad did not need charity from a sister who abandoned the family, even though he never paid attention to the fact that the money actually kept the lights on during the hardest months. People say families fall apart in big, dramatic moments, but mine frayed slowly thread by thread until one day it snapped without warning, and the first moment I realized something was deeply wrong happened 2 months before Dad died, when I came home and saw an old folder on the bottom shelf of his office cabinet, a folder he used for documents he considered important enough to hide from the chaos of the workshop, and inside was a draft of a will written before the chemo had taken his strength, and in that draft the estate was split evenly 50-50 between me and Luke, with clear instructions for oversight and a note in Dad's handwriting saying Jade understands the numbers, she will keep things honest. And I remember touching those words like they might crumble, because he had trusted me more than I ever realized, and the weight of that trust still sits heavy on my chest. When Callahan later presented the official will, the one Luke insisted was final, my share had been reduced to almost nothing, and Luke's had grown, and my mother kept saying that Dad changed his mind near the end. But all I could think about was that folder, hidden away months earlier, when Dad was still clear in the head, and the shock settled into something colder. The suspicion that someone had edited the future while Dad was too weak to fight, and that suspicion would become the spark that lit everything that followed. The day of the funeral felt unreal from the moment I stepped out of the car into the icy Boise wind, because even though the church was small and familiar with its white siding and creaking steps, it felt colder than it ever had when Dad was alive. And as people filled the pews, offering short hugs and murmured condolences, I kept waiting for someone to pull me aside and tell me they were glad I came home, but no one did. And by the time we all drove back to the old house in Meridian for the gathering afterward, I already felt that old childhood ache forming the one that whispered you do not belong here and never really did. Inside the house, casseroles covered every inch of counter space, while relatives crowded around folding tables and mismatched chairs, and Luke stood near the entryway like he had already stepped into the role of head of the family, offering firm handshakes and nods of authority, while I drifted in and out of small, meaningless conversations with people who barely remembered I existed. And it was not until I sat at the long dining table that the humiliation truly began. A woman I barely recognized, one of my mother's cousins, planted herself at the end of the table with a fork in her hand and a voice much louder than the room required, and called out, "Jade, when are you finally moving back and helping your brother for real?" And the chatter around us quieted just enough for a few heads to turn, and several people smiled, expecting me to blush or laugh it off because they all thought it was harmless, teasing even though nothing about it felt harmless to me. I opened my mouth, ready to politely explain that I had ideas that could streamline the business, that I understood the financials better than they assumed, that I could even introduce simple CRM systems to help Dad's aging client lists transition into modern structure. But Luke cut me off before I could form the first sentence and said she is too busy playing with millionaires in Seattle to deal with our little blue-collar life. And he tossed it out casually, the way someone tosses breadcrumbs to ducks, and the whole table erupted in laughter as if the line came from a sitcom character they all adored. An uncle across from me wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and added, "As long as she shows up when there is a check to sign, right?" And the laughter grew louder while my mother gave a weak, "Oh, stop you guys," but did nothing else, and the flush in my cheeks turned from embarrassment to something sharper, something that felt like a match scraping across rough sandpaper. But I kept my face still because that was how I had survived for years. I excused myself a few minutes later, pretending I needed a moment alone, and slipped down the hallway into the small bathroom near Dad's old office and closed the door quietly behind me, letting the noise of the crowd fade into a muffled background hum. I pulled my phone from my pocket more out of reflex than intention, and the screen lit up with a new email from the CEO of LumaPay, the subject line reading board seat conversation after Series D, and my breath hitched because it felt unreal to see it there in the cramped, dim bathroom of my childhood home, while the people in the next room laughed about how I did nothing meaningful. I opened the message and read quickly, noting the careful praise, the strategic tone, the implication that I was being considered for something only a handful of women in my industry ever reached, and my heart pounded with a mixture of pride and grief, because I wanted so badly to tell Dad he had been right to believe in me, and the contrast between the world waiting for me in Seattle and the tiny, cruel version they held of me here made me feel split in two. I splashed cool water on my face, dried it with a towel that still smelled faintly of detergent from years ago, and forced myself to return to the noise even though the room felt smaller with every step I took. When I re-entered the kitchen, the men were standing in a loose circle talking about the business, and Luke was explaining loudly that he planned to expand Porter Heat and Air into a regional franchise, claiming there was no ceiling for someone with vision and work ethic like his, and several nodded approvingly, even though he had never once shown genuine long-term discipline in running the company. They barely acknowledged me until I tried to gently suggest that selling a small portion of the business could diversify assets and reduce risk during probate, which was a reasonable suggestion in any world except this one, because Luke spun toward me with a grin that held no warmth and said, "You are not touching Dad's work. Go sell your little app. This is real money." And the group chuckled again, and I felt my spine stiffen as if someone had slipped a steel rod down the center of my back. I moved away to help stack plates near the sink because sometimes small motions were the only way to hold myself together, and as I wiped crumbs from the counter, I heard it before I saw them. Luke leaning close to my mother, speaking in that low voice he used when he wanted to sound reasonable but also final, and he said she does not need any of this. She is single. No kids. I have a family to feed. Dad would want me to have more. And my mother whispered, "Just do not make it ugly, Luke," as if the ugliness was something floating in the air waiting to land rather than something he was actively doing. I froze with a dish in my hands and realized that whatever decisions had been made regarding the estate had not been made today or yesterday, but had been discussed quietly behind doors without me, with excuses ready to soften the cruelty. And that was the moment the truth settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. They had already decided my worth long before I walked into the room, and it did not include fairness or respect or the 50-50 Dad had once intended. The first probate meeting with Callahan took place 3 days after the funeral, and even though the conference room smelled like lemon cleaner and the snow outside had finally stopped falling, I felt the same heaviness in my chest that I had felt in the church pews, because I already knew this was not going to be a discussion about fairness or truth, but a performance that Luke had rehearsed long before I arrived. And the moment Callahan opened the folder in front of him and adjusted his glasses, I understood just how deeply that performance had been embedded into the paperwork itself. He cleared his throat politely, then slid a stack of documents toward us and said, "This is the final will, as filed and certified," and as he listed the allocations. My pulse thudded against my ribs. Luke receives ownership of Porter Heat, and Air the residential property and the primary investment accounts, and Jade receives a small cash disbursement along with a minor share of the insurance policy, and the words felt distant, like he was reading them through water, and I forced myself to breathe slowly, even while each line cut deeper. I steadied my voice and said I saw a draft of Dad's will a few months before he passed. It said 50-50 between me and Luke for the business and the assets, and Callahan hesitated, his pen hovering mid-air before he replied, "Thomas revised things before he passed. He mentioned that you were busy in Seattle and that Luke was the one helping daily, and that sentence hit me like a shove because it was vague, convenient, and impossible to verify now that Dad was gone." Luke leaned back in his chair, folding his arms with the smugness he always wore when he believed he owned the room, and said she barely visited when he was in chemo. I took him to every appointment, and the lie slid so smoothly off his tongue. that if I did not know my own life, I might have believed him. But the truth was that I flew in 1 to 2 weeks every month and worked remote from Dad's bedside, while Luke spent half his days at the bar with friends or bragging at the shop about being the future owner. Yet because I never posted photos or announced my sacrifices, no one in that room could challenge his revision of our history. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my tone neutral when I asked for a full copy of all financial records from the 12 months before Dad died. And Callahan shifted again, glancing awkwardly toward Luke before saying, Luke already handled those. He had power of attorney, and my stomach dropped because I remembered when Dad told me he was granting Luke temporary authority only for medical decisions and a few business invoices, not for full financial access, and Luke immediately added I had to move money around to keep the doors open. Dad trusted me with that. The accountant has the details, and his voice carried the smooth certainty of someone who believed that confidence could erase scrutiny. But I could smell it the way other people smell smoke or gasoline, the faint, acrid scent of financial manipulation disguised as responsibility. And even though no one else reacted, I felt the professional part of my mind switch on the part trained to follow numbers until they exposed their own trail. The humiliation did not end there, because as soon as we walked out of the building into the parking lot where the snow had turned into slush, Luke stepped close enough that his shoulder brushed mine, and in a voice low enough to avoid witnesses, he said, "You walk away with that cash and we call it even, but if you fight me, I will show everyone what an ungrateful daughter you were." And the phrase ungrateful daughter landed like a blow, because it was the oldest knife in the family. Arsenal used on women who dared to question the distribution of labor affection or money, and used even more cruelly when they dared to expect fairness. I stared at him for a moment, studying the way he stood with the confidence of someone who believed that entitlement was the same as moral authority, and for the first time in my life I saw him clearly not as the brother I had once defended to my friends, but as a man who had built his identity on the assumption that I would always stay small enough for him to overshadow. I drove back to the motel with the heater blasting against the cold, while my thoughts spun into a tight, burning knot, and once inside the dim room I locked the door, placed my laptop on the bed, and opened it with hands that felt both steady and furious, because Dad had trusted me with things he could not trust Luke with. And one of those things was access to an investment account he had asked me to manage for him the previous year, the account he called our safety net, the account only he and I knew the password to. I entered the credentials and waited as the page loaded, and when the transaction list appeared on the screen, I felt the air leave my lungs, because there it was a withdrawal of $250,000, made 5 months before Dad died, routed into an entity called Porter Family Management. And my eyes scanned the name again because I had never heard of that LLC, not once in any conversation. And the description on the transfer made no sense for any legitimate business purpose. And the date fell squarely within the period when Dad was too weak to sign anything without shaking. A cold clarity settled over me as I scrolled further and saw more irregularities small enough to hide behind explanations, but consistent enough to form a pattern. And I knew with every certainty I possessed that money had been moved intentionally, not for the business, not for Dad, but to shift assets into a place where they would not be counted in probate and not be divided according to any will draft, not even the one Luke claimed was final. I sat back slowly, feeling the weight of what this meant, not only for the estate, but for the truth of what my brother had been doing while pretending he was the noble caretaker. And in the low hum of the motel heater, I heard Dad's words again. "Don't let them erase you." And for the first time since he died, I felt a strange calm settle into my spine, a calm that whispered that the story Luke had rewritten was about to unravel under the one thing he could never control: the numbers themselves. I spent the rest of that week moving between spreadsheets, bank statements, and the ache that sat low in my chest like a quiet bruise that refused to fade. And on the morning of December 23rd, when the sky over Seattle was the color of wet concrete, I decided to call my mother because some fragile part of me still hoped she would at least ask if I was coming home for Christmas, and maybe that tiny gesture would mean the story Luke was writing had not completely replaced reality yet, and when she picked up, her voice sounded rushed, distracted, almost rehearsed as she said, "We are keeping it simple this year. It is just Luke, his kids, a few neighbors. It might be crowded, and maybe we can do something just us girls in January." And the way she elongated the word crowded told me everything she did not want to say directly, that my presence was not needed, that the narrative of me being too busy, too distant, too wrapped up in my so-called big city life had become convenient enough to use as an excuse. I swallowed hard and told her that January was fine, then stared at my phone for a long moment after the call ended, feeling the familiar sinking pull that comes when someone who is supposed to be your anchor quietly chooses the storm instead. And on Christmas Eve, I sat alone in my apartment with leftover Thai takeout reheated until the noodles were soggy, the rain tapping against the windows in that steady Seattle rhythm that can make even the bravest person feel small and invisible. And while the city outside glowed with holiday lights and fairy horns echoed faintly across the water, I opened Instagram without thinking and immediately regretted it. Luke had posted a photo of the whole family gathered around the tree in the living room where I used to build Lego towers with Dad, and the caption read, "Nothing matters more than having everyone you love under one roof," and the words hit me harder than I expected, because love was being used like a gate one that could be closed whenever it served him. Someone from high school commented, "Where is Jade?" with a sad face, and Luke replied, "Busy with her big city life, I guess." And the tiny shrug emoji after the sentence made my chest tighten, with a mix of humiliation and fury. And when I saw that my mother had liked that comment, something inside me cracked, in a way that was not loud, but final. I closed the app quickly because lingering there felt like letting myself be punched twice, and instead I opened the LumaPay dashboard on my laptop, watching the internal valuation meter that shifted slightly higher every week as the Series D approached, and the projected numbers told me that in less than 6 months, my net worth would likely cross $10 million. And as the cool glow of the screen reflected on my face, I whispered a bitter, quiet truth. I could buy their house twice over, and they still talk like I am the irresponsible one. And the sentence did not bring comfort, but it did create a strange clarity, like a clean vertical line dividing who I used to be with them and who I was now. My thoughts drifted to the folder of Dad's accounts, the one he trusted me to help manage when he joked that Luke could fix a furnace but would never save a password properly. And I remembered the auto-pay setups he had created years ago, the ones covering Luke's utilities during the tough months when the business hit a slow season, and Dad had never shut them off because he always believed Luke would eventually grow up and repay the kindness. But now Dad was gone, and probate was active, which meant that legally those payments could not continue. And if they did, it could be considered misuse of estate funds. So I drafted a formal email to the utility company and to the bank attaching Dad's death certificate and notifying them that all auto-pay transactions from his accounts needed to be paused until the probate process concluded. And as I hit send, I felt a sharp, small sense of alignment. Not vindictive, not petty. Simply correct, like adjusting a frame that had been crooked for too long, and for the first time since Dad died, I felt a faint spark of control returning to me. I went to bed early that night, letting the sound of rain dull the ache in my chest, and when my phone buzzed on the morning of December 26th, I already knew who it was before I picked it up, because chaos from Luke tended to arrive like clockwork, and his message glowed on the screen. "Did you mess with Dad's accounts? Our electric just got a shut-off notice." And I stared at the sentence for a long second, feeling a strange mixture of relief and anger, because it was predictable that he would assume any disruption to his comfort must be sabotage rather than consequence. I typed slowly, "Estate funds are not your personal allowance anymore. That is what probate means." And when I sent it, I felt my spine straighten, as if the words themselves added weight to my posture, because it was the first time I had spoken to him from a place that was neither fear nor apology, but simple truth. And although my fingers trembled slightly, the trembling was not weakness. It was the sensation of a boundary locking into place. I sat back on the edge of my bed, realizing that something fundamental had shifted, because for the first time, Luke was confronting a world where he no longer had access to invisible money pools, where Dad was no longer there to absorb his mistakes, and where I was no longer the silent sister he could guilt or dismiss. And I understood then that the darkness of that Christmas was not just about being excluded. It was about being freed from expectations that had only ever benefited everyone but me. I closed my phone and looked out at the gray Seattle morning, feeling the faintest glimmer of something I had not felt in weeks. Not joy, not victory, but the early quiet of a storm that was finally beginning to turn in my direction. The flight to Aspen cut through a sky so clear it looked polished, and when the plane descended over the white ridges of the Rockies, I felt a brief moment of weightlessness, as if the mountains themselves were reminding me that elevation can change perspective. And by the time I took the shuttle toward the resort, the world outside looked untouched. Soft powder on pine branches, clean air sharp enough to taste, and the lodge rising ahead with its warm amber windows felt like stepping into a different life. One where the conversations were about strategy valuation and future markets rather than guilt obligation and who owed what to whom. The place was elegant but not showy, thick stone walls, dark wood beams, and small fires crackling in every corner. And as I walked into the check-in area, I heard a familiar voice say, "Welcome to the part of the world where numbers finally mean what they are supposed to mean." And when I turned, Daniel was standing there in a charcoal sweater, the kind that looked effortless but expensive, and his smile carried a steadiness that made something in my stomach unclench. He took my bag with an ease that felt almost protective, then guided me toward the lounge where a few founders and analysts were talking near the fireplace. And after we sat, he asked how I was holding up, and I hesitated because a part of me still felt guilty about sharing family matters, especially ones laced with money, betrayal, and grief. But the other part of me was exhausted from carrying the whole story alone, so I exhaled and told him everything from the draft. Will I found, to the missing $250,000, to being erased from Christmas, as if I were a distant relative rather than a daughter. He listened without interrupting his eyes, sharp, thoughtful, and when I finally stopped talking, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Jade, if this was on my desk as a case, I would flag at least 3 probable violations already." And the firmness in his voice made heat rush to my face, because for months I had been wondering if my instincts were wrong, if grief had warped my judgment. But hearing him say it with that calm certainty made me feel less like a paranoid daughter and more like a professional whose expertise had finally found a witness. When he stood to grab us coffee, I watched him walk away and caught a whisper of conversation from 2 analysts behind me. Someone saying, "Is that the guy who shut down that fraudulent fund in Colorado?" And the other replying, "Yeah, Daniel Reyes, he is basically the reason those 2 executives ended up indicted." And something clicked into place because he had mentioned he worked in forensic finance, but he had never spelled out that he was the forensic director of a firm contracted by both the DOJ and the SEC, and realizing that made my breath catch. Because suddenly, the weight of his words earlier held a deeper truth. He was not just giving an opinion. He was giving a preliminary assessment from someone who lived and breathed financial misconduct. When he returned with 2 mugs, he sat beside me rather than across and said, "Let us do something simple, something that will give you ground to stand on." And he opened his laptop, then guided me through signing into the accounts Dad once asked me to help manage. And together we downloaded every electronic statement from the past 18 months, saving them into a separate drive and backing them up twice. And the process felt so normal. downloading zips, organizing folders, highlighting lines above $10,000. Yet the meaning behind each click was enormous because it transformed my suspicions into a map of transactions that could later prove intent. And Daniel explained quietly that we were not hunting for drama. We were documenting patterns the way any responsible executor would, and as we worked side by side, I felt the strange mixture of grief and empowerment tugging at me, a reminder that I was not crazy, I was not overreacting, and the numbers were beginning to speak. That night, the group gathered for a small New Year's Eve dinner in the private dining room facing the slopes, and soft music played under the low hum of conversations about Series D term sheets, future markets, and global partnerships, and I found myself seated next to Daniel again, his presence steady, warm, and quietly encouraging. And sometime after dessert, one of the founders stood to take a group photo, insisting everyone squeeze together near the windows, where the snow reflected the moonlight like crushed glass, and Daniel stood close, his arm brushing mine in a way that felt both innocent and electric. And when the photo was posted later with the caption, "Starting 2025, with the sharpest minds in fintech compliance, watch this space," I felt my heart jerk because the photographer tagged Daniel and me directly. And in the picture, the two of us looked like a matched pair, aligned in posture, expression, and confidence, as if the universe had placed him next to me on purpose. I tried to brush it off, but hours later, when I checked my phone again, I saw that the photo had already circulated surprisingly far, because someone from Meridian, a girl I vaguely remembered from high school, had shared it in a local Facebook group, and her comment read, "Wait, is this?" The guy who put those two CEOs in prison, followed by a string of shocked reactions, and I sat there staring at the screen, realizing that without saying a single word to my family, the world had just been handed a small glimpse of who I had become and who stood beside me now. Someone powerful, someone respected, and someone who made it very clear that the story unfolding back home was about to be examined through a lens Luke could never manipulate. The photo continued spreading long after the New Year fireworks faded, and by the time I woke up the next morning, sunlight spilling through the heavy curtains and the faint scent of coffee drifting under my door, my phone was vibrating non-stop with call after call, text after text, notifications stacking so quickly the screen froze for a moment, and when I finally managed to swipe open, I saw my mother's name at the top. Her message frantic and trembling as if she had aged 10 years overnight, asking, "Who is this man? People are whispering your name around town. Jade. They are saying he worked with federal agencies. Is there something we should know?" And before I could finish reading it, Luke's message barged in, loud, even through text, asking, "What game are you playing? Do you actually think strutting around with some fed dog is going to scare me?" And something in me shifted because only 24 hours earlier, my hands would have shaken reading that, but after the conversations with Daniel, after the data we had gathered, after feeling the ground of truth under my feet, again, I felt strangely calm, steady, even almost like my heartbeat had slowed enough to let me think clearly for the first time in months. I typed one single message, added both of them, and wrote, "I am safe. I am working. I will be in Boise for the next mediation. Until then, do not contact me to insult me." Then I muted the thread and set the phone face down. The silence afterward felt like oxygen. Downstairs, the lodge was bright with New Year travelers, and the crisp sound of boots against the hardwood floor echoed gently as Daniel walked toward me, holding 2 cups of coffee, and when he saw my expression, he raised an eyebrow, asking, so the photo landed exactly where it needed to, and I let out a breath. I did not know I had been holding, and told him about the messages, and he listened carefully, nodding slowly before saying, "Jade, this is exactly why you cannot keep carrying this alone. People like your brother count on fear and confusion to stay in control." Later that day, when we settled into one of the quieter corners of the lounge, he introduced me to someone over a video call, a woman with sharp eyes and a calm confidence who introduced herself as Sandra Klein, a probate attorney in Denver, who specialized in financial elder abuse and estate manipulation. And when she asked me to walk her through the timeline, I laid everything out: the transfers, the draft will, the shift in narrative, the threats, the pressure, the missing $250,000. And the more I spoke, the more her expression tightened, with a look I recognized from professionals who had seen this pattern too many times. And when I finished, she said, if these transfers happened while your father's capacity was compromised, and if your brother used power of attorney to move funds without clear necessity, there is a real chance a judge will reverse significant portions of what has been done, and there is a non-zero chance he may face separate scrutiny depending on the findings. And hearing that allowed something inside me to straighten like a spine, realigning after years of bending. She continued in a measured voice, saying, we need to document everything, every threat, every attempt to pressure you, every contradictory statement, every financial record you have access to. And she guided me through the steps, insisting that I screenshot every message where Luke said he would take everything, compile dates, times, conversations, even moments that felt small, because small things become patterns, and patterns become evidence. And her tone was so practical, so grounded, that it removed the shame I had been carrying, the feeling of being dramatic or overly emotional or ungrateful for simply recognizing wrongdoing. I spent the next 2 hours compiling a clean folder on my laptop, each screenshot cropped and labeled, each memory suddenly turning into documented reality instead of foggy pain. And with every file saved, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and power, because I was archiving the collapse of the version of family I had grown up believing in, while also building the case for the truth my father would have wanted recognized. When I finished, I looked up at Sandra's face on the screen, and she said, good. This is what standing your ground looks like. You are not fighting for more. You are fighting to correct what was altered. After the call, she sent an email to Callahan, perfectly formal and devastatingly concise, requesting a temporary freeze on specific estate accounts and full accounting for the 12 months before Thomas Porter's passing, and asking him to produce supporting documentation for all transfers made under power of attorney. And within minutes of her sending it, my phone buzzed with a brief forwarded message from Daniel, who had somehow already been copied by someone in the chain, showing that Callahan had sent the email directly to Luke with a private note that read, we may have a more complicated situation than anticipated. I imagined Luke reading those words, his certainty cracking just a little, the illusion of invincibility wavering, and even though I felt no triumph, only clarity. I knew this was the first moment he realized the game was no longer being played in the dark corners of our family kitchen. This was now in daylight, in the hands of professionals who saw exactly what he had done, and the fear he had counted on was no longer mine to hold. By the time I flew back to Boise for the mediation, the air felt painfully sharp in the early January cold, and my breath fogged in front of me as I walked toward the neutral office building where everything would finally be laid out, in a room that had no patience for family myths or small-town loyalties. And when I stepped inside the conference room, the lighting was flat and unforgiving, the kind that made every twitch readable and every lie visible, which somehow felt right, because I was done living in shadows and excuses and half-truths. Luke sat on one side of the table, legs spread like he owned the carpet under him, and Elaine sat beside him, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles had turned white, and Callahan arranged his folders with the stiff politeness of someone who knew this was no longer a simple family disagreement, but a situation that might become significantly more dangerous to his reputation. The mediator greeted everyone with the practiced calm of someone who lived inside conflict for a living, and I took my seat directly across from Luke while Daniel settled quietly behind me, offering silent support, and Sandra appeared on the large monitor, her posture straight and her eyes razor-focused. Luke cleared his throat first and said with a voice dripping false patience, "We are here to split things fairly. My sister simply does not understand the numbers." And he tried to smile in that patronizing way he had leaned on for years, as if the entire town had always agreed that I was the one who got confused easily. I opened my notebook slowly, the sound of the pages turning unusually loud in the quiet room, and began explaining in an even voice the care timeline during our father's illness, listing each month and each visit, each set of plane tickets, each time I worked remotely from his bedside, each amount I had transferred home to help with expenses, each conversation where Dad told me he was proud of what I was building and that he wanted both his children to share equally in what he had built for 30 years. And I watched the mediator nod and write and nod again, and with each detail, Luke's smile grew tighter. I told them about the draft Will I had seen when Dad was still strong enough to walk me through the sections, the version that split everything 50-50. The version that matched how he had always spoken about fairness and responsibility, and the mediator leaned forward slightly, as if that detail weighed more than the others. Sandra then asked me to pause, and she addressed the room, reminding everyone that my statements needed to be considered alongside the financial evidence, and she gave Daniel a small nod, which he was waiting for, and he reached into his folder, pulling out printed sheets of the transaction logs we had processed together in Aspen, the clean lines of numbers and dates stark against the white page. He slid them across the table, and the mediator lifted them, first scanning quickly before his brow furrowed, and he asked for the screen to be shared as well, so the copy on the monitor could be enlarged and visible to everyone, including Sandra, who narrowed her eyes and said, "This pattern is consistent with undue influence. A court will want to see this." The mediator cleared his throat and began reading aloud the dates of 3 transfers, each one above $80,000, each one moving out of my father's personal account into the LLC Luke controlled, and each one occurring before the power of attorney was formally executed, according to our father's medical records, which showed that on those exact dates, his judgment was significantly compromised due to hospitalization. The room shifted then like air pressure changing before a storm, and Luke's face drained of color, though he tried to recover with a shrug, muttering something about paying bills and keeping the company afloat. But the mediator cut him off, asking, "Mr. Porter, can you explain why these transfers occurred while your father's capacity was clearly compromised?" And for the first time, maybe in years, Luke had no quick answer, no snide remark ready, and he glanced at Elaine, who looked stunned, whispering, "Luke, you told me it was just paying bills. Just routine bills," and her voice cracked in a way that told me she was seeing her son without the protective filter she had used for decades. Callahan looked uncomfortable, shifting in his seat, adjusting his glasses, and Sandra spoke again, her voice calm, but carrying the kind of weight that changes a room, saying if we do not reach a fair agreement here, we will need to file a petition and possibly refer this to the state attorney's office, where these transfers would be examined under a much harsher standard, and her tone made it clear this was not a threat. This was an inevitability if honesty was not restored. Luke inhaled sharply, and his jaw twitched, the first visible sign that fear had finally entered him. Not the fear of losing money, but the fear of being exposed outside the family bubble, where charm and manipulation had always been enough. And I felt something loosen inside me, not satisfaction, not triumph, just the truth, finally standing without apology. The mediator asked for a brief recess, and as Luke walked out, he avoided my eyes, his shoulders tense and stiff, and for the first time I saw what he had been terrified of the entire time. Not that I would take what was his, but that the world would finally see what he had taken that was never his to begin with. When we returned to the mediation table after the recess, the temperature in the room felt different, as if the air itself had shifted its weight, and everyone could sense that the balance of power was no longer tilted toward the louder voice, but toward the facts, sitting quietly on printed pages and glowing on the shared screen. And the mediator asked if both sides were ready to continue, and Luke muttered something that sounded like yes, but his jaw was still clenched, and his eyes kept darting toward the transaction logs like they were landmines he had forgotten he buried. Sandra spoke first, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who did not bluff, and she proposed that before this moved further, the parties should consider a structured resolution that reflected fairness and corrected any questionable transfers. And she outlined the conditions with an eerie clarity, saying the will should return to the earlier draft, which reflected the intentions Thomas expressed consistently to both children, that the estate be divided equally, and that any sums taken out under suspicious circumstances be resolved through a reduction of Luke's share, and that Porter Heat and heir undergo an independent audit with a temporary general manager appointed for 12 months to ensure compliance and transparency. Luke tried to object with a weak laugh, insisting it was all unnecessary. But the mediator lifted a hand, reminding him that the evidence had already established enough irregularities to justify a much more aggressive legal route. And Luke finally leaned back, looking as if he were chewing stones before muttering, "Fine, fine, whatever keeps this from going to court." I kept my face still, although inside something steady and sharp was rising, because for the first time I was not the daughter being talked over or dismissed. I was the woman who had spent her entire career building systems that detected deception and tracked financial misconduct. And this time, the target was not an offshore shell company or an anonymous fraud ring, but my own brother, who had always assumed I was too soft, too naive to fight back. When the mediator asked if I had additional conditions, I nodded slowly and said there was one more point that needed formalization, and I explained that for years, Dad had offered cash discounts to certain longtime customers, something done out of kindness but never documented properly, creating holes in the books that Luke later used as his personal slush fund. And before Luke could interrupt, I asked that every one of those legacy discounts be reviewed, documented, and folded into the company's official billing system going forward, which sounded like a small administrative formality. But I knew, and Luke knew, that this cut off the exact stream of under-the-table money he had relied on for years. His head snapped toward me, and he hissed that it was petty, but I replied calmly that transparency was not petty, especially when an estate was being managed, and the mediator agreed, noting that such an update would protect the company and the heirs. And Luke pushed back in his chair with a bitter smile, realizing this was not about winning anymore, but about minimizing the damage he had brought upon himself. After the terms were written into the draft agreement, the mediator gave each of us a moment to read through, and while Luke glared at the papers like they were soaking up his pride, I felt a quiet resolve building in my chest, and I glanced behind me at Daniel, who gave a subtle nod, the kind of nod that said, "Keep going. You have every right to finish this properly." What no one in the room knew was the conversation I had shared with Daniel the night before, as we sat in the hotel lounge with the fireplace whispering behind us, and I told him that part of me was considering something much larger than just protecting my inheritance. That part of me wondered if in 3 or 5 years after the dust settled and after the audit exposed the true mess hiding beneath Porter Heat and Air, I might buy out Luke's portion and rebuild the business in the way Dad had once described, with honesty and structure and actual vision rather than entitlement and shortcuts. Daniel had let out a soft laugh, not mocking but impressed, saying, "So, one day you will own both a unicorn and a heater company that is quite a portfolio, Jade," and the thought had made me smile because it was absurd and yet strangely fitting a blend of where I came from and where I had built myself into. The mediator's pen scratched across the summary sheet, and he announced that the draft would reflect that Luke would receive significantly less than he expected, and that I would receive significantly more. And Luke clenched his fist under the table, though he nodded because he knew he could not risk an open investigation and the humiliation that would follow him through every corner of Meridian. As the meeting ended and everyone stood gathering their papers and bags, my phone buzzed and I recognized the sender. Immediately, the CEO of LumaPay, and the preview line made my pulse jump. "Board wants you in New York next month. We are accelerating the Series D timeline," and I read it twice, then tucked the phone into my coat. Because even though this fight for Dad's legacy felt enormous, the world I lived in professionally was shifting too, and the timing could not have been more poetic, because while Luke had tried to cut me down to keep me small, the truth was rising in every direction. When I walked out of the building, the Boise air was cold enough to sting my cheeks, but for the first time since Dad died, I felt a steady heat in my chest, not anger, but the certainty that I was not done yet, and that this was only the beginning of reclaiming everything they thought I would never be strong enough to protect. A few quiet months passed after the mediation, and while I focused on work flying between Seattle and New York for the upcoming Series D meetings, the fallout of everything began to seep back toward me through the most unexpected channels. Because Porter Heat and Air, the business Dad built with his bare hands, and Luke inherited with more arrogance than skill, was cracking under the weight of its own mess, and I started receiving small updates from people in Meridian who still followed me online and whispered that the bank had refused Luke's refinance application, since his credit report showed irregularities and outdated filings, and that customers were hesitating to sign new contracts because the word legal dispute kept circling the town like a winter draft. No one could shut out, and even though I never wished failure on the company my father loved, I could not ignore how the consequences were finally landing in the lap of the man who once told me he would take everything from me. When the call came, it was late afternoon in Seattle, the sky the washed-out gray that always made the city feel suspended between rain and silence, and I let the phone ring twice before picking up, because I already knew who it was and what tone he would use, and Luke's voice came through with the familiar edge, the sharpness he had sharpened on me for decades. But underneath it, there was something new, something strained and almost pleading as he said, "Look, you got what you wanted, the new terms, the changes, the audit, the whole thing." And I let the words float in the air because they were not true. Nothing I got was handed to me. I had fought for every page, every clause, every scrap of respect. Yet Luke said them like I had twisted his arm for sport. Then he exhaled loudly before continuing, "Can you at least co-sign this loan so I can keep the business afloat?" And I felt my pulse slow, not in fear, but in recognition, because this was the exact moment every toxic family story eventually circles back to: the moment the person who tried to rob you of stability comes crawling back, asking you to save the sinking ship they drilled holes into themselves. I stayed quiet long enough that he grew uncomfortable. Then he added with a forced chuckle, "You are rich now with your apps or whatever. Have some mercy," like he could make kindness sound like an obligation. And I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because for once he was speaking a truth he did not understand, and he had no idea how far the world around me had changed since Aspen and since the mediation, because only a week earlier LumaPay had secured a new $120 million investment, bumping our valuation to $600 million, and with it my equity now worth around $15 million on paper, a number that still felt unreal to me whenever I saw it on internal dashboards. I told Luke to hold on, and I pulled up the article Daniel had forwarded that morning, a glowing profile on LumaPay titled, "Local Girl Helps Lead 600 Million Seattle FinTech." We catch the kind of fraud that starts at home, and the headline alone carried a weight that made my chest tighten, because I knew Luke was about to see it not as pride or accomplishment, but as a mirror reflecting everything he never bothered to learn about me. So I sent him the link without commentary and waited. There was silence first, then a faint sound like a chair scraping as if he had stood up too fast, and his voice when it returned was no longer confident, no longer self-assured, but thin and breathless, like the ground had tilted under him, and he asked, "This is you?" And I answered yes. Simply, yes. And I could visualize his face draining of color the way it used to when Dad caught him lying. And for the first time, Luke understood not the number, not the valuation, not the equity, but the fact that I was no longer the little sister he could bully into compliance and expect to fold when he raised his voice. I told him calmly I am not co-signing anything, and I leaned against the window looking out at the cranes along the Seattle waterfront, thinking how strange life was, How the same girl once accused of not understanding real money was now the one protecting herself from a man who treated financial misconduct like a birthright. And I said, I have no intention of being cleaned out because you still refuse to run things honestly. And the words came out without heat, just clarity. And it struck me that this was the first time I had spoken to my brother without shrinking even a little. He tried blustering again, grasping at the old dynamic, telling me that if the business died, it would be my fault, that I would be the one who destroyed Dad's legacy. But I heard something crack in his voice, the thin, splintering sound of a narrative collapsing under the weight of truth. And when the line went quiet, I looked out at the skyline, the faint reflection of my own face in the glass, and I thought he tried to take everything. The only thing dying now is his illusion of entitlement. And for the first time since Dad passed, I felt something close to peace settle into my bones, a sense that the war he started was ending, not with vengeance, but with truth, finally landing where it belonged. In the weeks that followed Luke's desperate call, something in the air around Meridian began to shift, not abruptly like a storm breaking, but slowly and steadily, the way ice starts to crack under the first real warmth of spring. And I heard about it in fragments from old classmates, from Dad's former customers, and from silent observers who had always kept one eye on the Porter family, because in a small Idaho town, everyone knows the truth long before anyone admits it. Luke's business troubles did not explode overnight. They leaked out in pieces, beginning with the sight of 2 old Porter Heat and air trucks parked on the edge of a dealer lot, because he had been forced to sell them to cover payroll. And then came the layoffs, the kind that hit a town like Meridian in the gut, since everyone knows someone who relied on those jobs. And customers started to whisper that something was off because the new bank requirements forced Luke to submit a complete audit. And once the accountants peeled back the layers, they found the inconsistencies, the cash that had never been recorded. The under-the-table discounts Dad once considered kindness now twisted into something Luke treated as personal spending money. And for the first time, the community saw clearly what I had seen for years. I never celebrated any of that because it was still Dad's company, and seeing it unravel felt like watching a piece of him fade. But actions have consequences, and Luke's were catching up with him faster than his excuses could outrun them. And the same people who once chuckled at his jokes about my so-called big city arrogance began to soften toward me in their language, shifting from Jade, left her family, to Jade, might have been the one telling the truth. And a neighbor even posted under an article about the mediation. Maybe Thomas's girl from Seattle isn't the greedy one after all. That line sat with me for days, not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me of Dad, the only one who ever bothered to understand what I actually did, and the only one who believed that integrity mattered even when it cost you something. When my portion of the estate finally cleared, I stared at the numbers, not with triumph, but with a strange, quiet heaviness, because there is no joy in winning something you should not have had to fight for. And I found myself thinking of ways to honor Dad instead of ways to defeat Luke. And it came to me on a rainy evening in Seattle as I looked over the latest financial reports from LumaPay and thought about how many young people in Meridian never had the resources to pursue technical training, even though Idaho desperately needed HVAC technicians and service workers. So I took a portion of my profit and created a local scholarship fund in Dad's name, focused on HVAC training, a simple pipeline for students in Treasure Valley to attend a community college or technical program with full tuition covered. And each year, a handful of young adults would start careers they could build families on without needing Luke's approval or being trapped in his shadow. And it felt like a small but meaningful step, not a dramatic revenge, but a correction. A way to close the wound Dad's legacy had suffered. When the news reached Meridian, some people were surprised, some even embarrassed, because they had believed the worst about me for years. But the shift was real, and for the first time since the funeral, the town spoke my name without a wince attached to it. Then came the day Elaine arrived at my apartment unannounced, carrying an old album wrapped in a grocery bag and looking smaller, somehow like the years had finally settled on her shoulders, and she asked if she could come in with a voice so thin I could not bring myself to say no, even though part of me still held the cold memory of her silence, while Luke attacked me in the kitchen over the $6 million. She sat on my couch and opened the album with careful fingers, flipping through faded photos of birthdays and summers and the first Porter Heat and air truck Dad ever bought. And as she traced the images, her eyes began to fill until tears slid down her cheeks, uninvited, and she whispered, "I did not see what he was doing." Jade, I did not want to see. I just wanted to believe he was the good son, and hearing that felt like being hit and hugged at the same time, because it exposed the truth underneath everything she had chosen, comfort over honesty. And I had paid the price for that choice for years. I took a long breath, unsure whether to comfort her or let the confession hang in the air, and eventually I said quietly, "Next time, when someone tells you they are hurt, do not wait for proof in a bank statement." And her face crumpled because she knew exactly what I meant, and she nodded through her tears, promising she would do better. Although I knew promises are fragile things in families like ours, I did not fully forgive her. Not then. Maybe not ever. But I opened a small door, a narrow space where honesty could step through, because holding bitterness forever would only anchor me to a story I had already outgrown. And as she left, she paused at the door, looking at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the complicated daughter who left Idaho, but as a woman who fought to protect what her father built with the strength no one expected her to have. New Year's Eve arrived 1 year after the mediation, and the air in Seattle carried that cold, bright shimmer the city always seems to wear on the last night of December. And I found myself standing beside Daniel on the rooftop of a friend's apartment overlooking the bay, where boats glided like small shadows across the dark water, and fireworks were already loading onto barges for the midnight show. And even though it was not a yacht or some extravagant gala, the way people might imagine success looks, it felt perfect. With a small circle of founders and attorneys and compliance leads, all talking softly over warm drinks and the steady hum of anticipation rising through the city. I had not planned on mentioning Meridian or the business or anything tied to that past, but someone recognized my last name from the mediation articles that had circulated through a few legal blogs, and they asked, with casual curiosity, "Is Porter Heat an air your family business?" And I felt a strange, almost gentle warmth as I answered it, "Is my dad's legacy. My brother just had a hard time learning." It was not his personal piggy bank, and the group around us laughed, not in mockery, but in understanding, because every person there knew at least one story of entitlement, masquerading as family duty, and the truth did not sting anymore. It simply existed like a chapter I had already finished reading. As the night deepened and music blended with the muffled conversations around us, Daniel nudged my arm and told me he needed to steal me for a moment, then guided me toward a quieter corner near the railing, where the wind was sharper and the view wider, and he waited for the right second before saying, "Our board wants you to take the Chief Compliance Officer title, and they are tying it to additional equity, and you are going to be on every industry panel next year." I blinked at him, because even though I had anticipated changes after the Series D, I had not expected the timing to collide with this very night, this anniversary of everything I had lost and reclaimed, and his words landed with a weight, both exhilarating and humbling, because it meant that my voice, the one Luke once called useless, was now being invited into rooms where regulations were shaped and national conversations began, and it meant that what started as a fight for $6 million had led to a far greater recognition of what I had built with years of grit and quiet consistency. As I stood there, absorbing the news, the fireworks test launched a single burst from the barge below, scattering gold sparks across the water, and the light reflected off the windows around us, illuminating the faces of people who respected me for what I brought to my field, not because of blood ties or shared history, but because of earned trust and unwavering standards. And I felt a swelling calm in my chest, the kind that only comes when you have walked through fire and somehow come out more defined instead of burned. I thought about the first day in that kitchen in Meridian, when Luke slammed the settlement papers into my lap and hissed that he would take everything, and how small and cornered I had felt, with my mother silently stirring her coffee, pretending nothing ugly was happening, and how the motel room that night smelled like cold air and cheap detergent, as I opened my laptop searching for a path forward with hands that would not stop shaking. Now standing here surrounded by people who valued integrity as much as innovation, I understood something I had not been wise enough to see. Back then, that the fight over $6 million was never the true mountain I needed to climb. It was only the catalyst, the opening crack that revealed the entire structure of dysfunction beneath it, and by choosing to confront it, I had stepped into the life my father believed I could build, long before I believed it myself. Midnight crept closer, and the rooftop filled with motion, people finding places along the railing. Glasses lifted laughter rising around us, and I felt Daniel's hand brush mine, a soft, steady presence, reminding me that even in the hardest seasons of this story there had been a future waiting where my world would be wider and kinder and more aligned with the woman I had become. As the first barrage of fireworks exploded across the sky, painting the bay in sweeping colors, I whispered to myself that he did take something from me. The illusion that blood automatically means loyalty in return. I took back my father's name, my share of what he built, and the right to never apologize for fighting for myself. And the words felt like a closing door behind me, not a slammed one, but a firm final click that separated the pain from the peace. When the cheers rose around us and the sky kept blooming with light, I knew the final chapter of this part of my life was written not with revenge in its harshest form, but with justice in the quiet, deliberate way that leaves no scars on your spirit, only lessons etched into your bones. And I let myself breathe deeply, letting the cold air fill me as the old year slipped away and the new one took its place. And now I ask you, because stories like mine are never isolated, has anyone in your family ever tried to take everything, your money, your home, your peace? Did you let it go for the sake of family, or did you stand your ground? Share your story in the comments. Someone out there needs the courage you found.